Monday, May 26, 2026, 03:17 a.m. local time, somewhere over the Zaporizhzhia steppe in southern Ukraine, a Ukrainian drone unit receives a target package that has been building for 72 hours, a Russian logistics convoy of fuel trucks, ammunition trailers, and 2 mobile command posts moving under darkness along a dirt road that Ukrainian intelligence analysts had been cross-referencing with intercepted radio traffic, satellite imagery, and human source reports for 3 consecutive days, watching the convoy's pattern, predicting its route, calculating its timing down to a margin of 4 minutes, and the drone operator sitting behind a screen inside a hardened bunker buried 12 meters below a field that looks completely unremarkable from above, does not hesitate because there is no time to hesitate, because the convoy will reach its dispersal point in less than 14 minutes and then scatter across a 3-kilometer grid. And so the first strike goes in at 03:19 a.m., not with a cruise missile or artillery, but with a first-person view drone carrying a shaped charge warhead traveling at over 130 kilometers per hour in the hands of an operator who learned to fly through a headset that converts his entire visual field into the drone's camera feed. And the explosion lights up the infrared monitor in a white burst that bleeds across the sensor into overexposure. And before the secondary detonation from the fuel truck finishes, a second FPV drone is already committed to its intercept angle, and then a third, and by 03:24 a.m., what was a carefully coordinated Russian resupply operation is now burning wreckage spread across 400 meters of a dirt track that will take Russian logistics planners days to reroute around. And this single 5-minute engagement is not a headline in any Western newspaper this morning. It is simply Tuesday morning on the Southern Front, one of hundreds of similar engagements happening across the same 1,000-kilometer front on the same night, and yet multiplied across the week and the month. It is everything, because it is the granular mechanism through which the territorial shifts that the cumulative data now shows were actually produced, each small fire in the dark adding its contribution to a larger trend that analysts in Washington and Kyiv are only now beginning to fully quantify. In the week of May 19th through May 26th, 2026, according to measurements using Institute for the Study of War data compiled by Russia Matters, Russian forces lost a net 38 square miles of Ukrainian territory, their single largest weekly territorial reversal of the entire year, following a 29 square mile loss the week before and a 12 square mile loss the week before that, a cascading 3-week acceleration that signals something fundamental has shifted in the operational dynamic of this conflict, not a lucky raid or a temporary disruption, but a sustained and deepening Ukrainian ability to take and hold ground at a pace that Russian defensive preparations are no longer able to absorb. And the 4-week picture is even more striking because for the period of April 28th through May 26th, Russian forces recorded a net loss of 100 square miles of Ukrainian territory, roughly equivalent to the total land area of the island of Nantucket, contrasting sharply with the previous 4-week period from March 31st to April 28th, in which Russian forces lost only 26 square miles, meaning the rate of Russian territorial reversal roughly quadrupled in a single month, an acceleration that does not happen by accident, but reflects deliberate Ukrainian operational planning bearing coordinated fruit on multiple simultaneous axes of advance, with careful sequencing designed to prevent Russia from massing its limited reserves on any single front. To understand how Ukraine arrived at this moment, you have to go back to the winter, when Ukrainian forces began a quiet counteroffensive in the south that received almost no sustained coverage in the Western press because all the cameras and the analytical attention were focused on Kupiansk in the northeast and on the diplomatic theater in Washington, where peace frameworks were being proposed and rejected in the weekly rhythm that had come to characterize the war's political dimension. But while that distraction held, while the world was watching the wrong part of the map, Ukrainian ground forces were liberating settlements in western Zaporizhzhia Oblast at a pace not seen since the Kherson offensive of 2022, clearing villages methodically, consolidating new defensive lines before Russian forces could counterattack effectively, pushing the occupying formations back across terrain that Russian command had classified as stabilized and no longer requiring active defensive investment. and by late April 2026, the Institute for the Study of War was formally reporting that those gains had created what it described as cascading operational and strategic consequences for the Russian army's spring-summer offensive, targeting the fortified Donetsk cities known as the Fortress Belt, meaning the Russians had planned a major push towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk and had been building logistics for it through the winter, and instead of executing that offensive, they are now being forced into the oldest and most brutal dilemma in military history, the choice of where to send limited reserves when you were under serious pressure in two places simultaneously and do not have enough quality formations to hold both adequately. The two-front squeeze that destroyed Napoleon at Waterloo and broke the German general staff at the Marne. And what makes this moment so particularly significant is that Ukraine is deliberately exploiting exactly that dilemma, building pressure in the south to draw Russian reserves away from the east, and building simultaneous pressure in the east to prevent those reserves from concentrating in the south, a strategic approach that reflects a level of operational sophistication that the Ukrainian military in the desperate days of February 2022 simply did not possess, and that in May 2026 has become its most decisive instrument. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Syrskyi announced in the middle of May that Ukrainian offensive actions had exceeded Russian assault activity on May 14th, meaning for the first time in many months, the Ukrainians were generating more combat engagements than they were absorbing, and his drone forces commander, Major Robert Brovky, call sign Magyar, revealed that Ukrainian systems had struck 19,203 Russian personnel in just the first 19 days of May, with forces directly under his command accounting for more than 6,000 of those targeted engagements, an average rate of over 1,000 precision drone strikes per day sustained across nearly 3 consecutive weeks, a number that requires genuine effort to absorb because it represents an industrialization of precision aerial targeting that demands factories producing thousands of drone airframes weekly from commercial components, logistics chains delivering batteries and optical modules forward to units consuming material at rates no pre-war procurement planning anticipated, forward maintenance crews working overnight rotations to repair damaged systems within hours, and an intel pipeline feeding target coordinates in real time to operators who may be former university analysts. Students or former mechanics who discovered that skills developed in entirely civilian contexts mapped almost directly onto the skills required to conduct precision military strikes in total darkness against moving targets on complex terrain. At the center of all this Ukrainian success is Kupiansk, the northeastern city that Russia had publicly identified as a key objective and devoted substantial resources to capturing through the winter, deploying the specialist Rubicon drone suppression unit specifically to create conditions for a successful infantry assault, massing formations for repeated waves of attack against the city's outer defensive positions, using artillery, glide bombs, and armored probes in sequences designed to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders, managing simultaneous pressure on multiple other sectors, and failing every time, not because the Ukrainians possessed some magical technological edge, but because they had learned over 3 years of this war to build integrated defensive networks combining drone surveillance, drone strikes, pre-registered artillery, and mobile infantry in a way that made large-scale Russian assault formations functionally self-destructive. Each attacking wave visible as thermal signatures on Ukrainian sensors from kilometers away before Russian soldiers believed they were in danger. And by May 2026, Ukraine had not only held Kupiansk, but recaptured significant surrounding territory, driven Russian forces back across the Oskil River in sectors they had occupied for months, and fully cleared the city of Russian presence despite continued attempts by infiltration groups to push through broken terrain under cover of darkness. On the Russian side of the ledger, the personnel situation has reached a level of difficulty that no official communication acknowledges because the Russian Ministry of Defense in the first quarter of 2026 signed only 70,500 military service contracts, a number that analysts consistently identify as falling below the threshold required simply to compensate for ongoing losses, not to expand operational capacity or build reserves, but merely to to replace the men being killed and wounded at the current rate of fighting. And the total casualty estimate of 1 million Russian military personnel killed and wounded, cited in a late February 2026 assessment shared by a former senior Western official with direct intelligence access, represents roughly 4% of the entire Russian male population between the ages of 18 and 50. And it sits alongside the Ukrainian figure of 250,000 to 300,000 killed and wounded, and together these numbers explain why neither side has been able to accept a negotiated settlement its domestic public would receive as anything other than a declaration that the sacrifice was pointless. Because when you have paid that price, you demand terms that validate the payment, and those two demands cannot both be satisfied by the same agreement, which is why Zelensky's reported order, confirmed by The Economist in the final days of May, to prepare for another 2 to 3 years of war, reflects not despair, but the cold strategic arithmetic of a leader who has concluded that the only negotiating position justifying what Ukraine has already endured is one of continued demonstrated military strength. 1,700 kilometers to the southeast, the conflict between the United States and Iran that began on February 28, 2026, under the codename Operation Epic Fury, has entered its third month in a state that defies clean categorization, suspended between active war and failed peace in a configuration the history of modern conflict has no ready vocabulary for. And to understand where things stood in the final week of May, you have to understand what the February 28th operation actually was, because it was not a targeted surgical strike, but a broad simultaneous campaign across multiple Iranian cities, targeting military infrastructure, air defense networks, ballistic missile production facilities, and government buildings, conducted jointly by American and Israeli air power and designed to achieve what military theory calls a decapitation effect. And the opening salvo killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had governed the Islamic Republic since 1989 and more than any other individual shaped Iranian foreign policy, proxy network strategy, nuclear ambition, and regional posture across nearly 4 decades. And his elimination was intended to produce a collapse of regime cohesion sufficient to force Tehran to rapid capitulation. And it did not produce that collapse, because the Iranian state had spent decades deliberately building institutional redundancy against exactly this scenario. And instead of collapsing, Iran retaliated with hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones launched across the Middle East, targeting Israel, American military bases in Iraq and Syria and Qatar and Bahrain, Saudi oil infrastructure in Abqaiq in a strike that knocked 30% of Saudi production temporarily offline, and Emirati port facilities, and it closed the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz transformed a regional military conflict into a global economic crisis, because the strait carries approximately 20% of the world's oil supply through a shipping lane 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. And when Iran established the Persian Gulf Strait Authority to assert control over vessel transits and backed that assertion with Revolutionary Guard naval forces, Brent crude crossed $130 per barrel within a week. Shipping insurance rates for Gulf-bound voyages increased by factors of 10 in some categories. Food price inflation accelerated in import-dependent economies from Egypt to Bangladesh because global supply chains depend on Gulf-origin energy at almost every point in the production sequence. And families in Lagos and Jakarta and Cairo were explaining to their children why cooking gas had doubled in price as a consequence of decisions made in military rooms they had no knowledge of and no influence over. And that distributive quality of the economic pain, the fact that it fell on hundreds of millions of people who had nothing to do with American or Israeli strategic choices, generated international pressure on Washington to find a resolution that the domestic American political calculation alone would never have produced at the speed that external pressure demanded. Trump responded with his characteristic escalation pattern, issuing ultimatums with specific deadlines that then moved, March 21, then March 23, then April 7th, threatening to destroy Iranian energy infrastructure and bridges. And Pakistan stepped in to broker a conditional 2-week ceasefire on April 8th that produced 48 hours of genuine relief before Israel launched Operation Eternal Darkness on April 9th, striking more than 100 Hezbollah sites across southern Lebanon in a single night, killing at least 357 people. And Iran and Pakistan and Hezbollah declared the ceasefire violated, while Israel and the United States maintained that Lebanon was a separate theater entirely, not covered by any agreement between Washington and Iran. And that fundamental disagreement about what the ceasefire actually covered was the crack through which everything that followed poured, because the weeks after April 8th were not a ceasefire in any operational sense. They were a period of continued strikes, continued intercepts, continued casualties, and continued negotiations happening simultaneously, with both sides doing things in the field that contradicted what their diplomats were saying at the table. In South Lebanon through May, Israeli ground forces were not merely conducting airstrikes, but physically maneuvering deeper into Lebanese territory, seizing positions along the Litani River corridor, pushing past the yellow line boundary of their self-declared security zone, engaging Hezbollah units with formations including the Golani Brigade, the 35th Paratroopers Brigade, and the Givati Brigade in operations that Israeli commanders described as necessary defensive fortification and Lebanese authorities characterized as expanding illegal occupation, and Hezbollah was responding with rocket attacks on Israeli troop positions and drone operations that forced the Israeli Home Front Command to close schools in Galilee border communities and restrict outdoor gatherings, and Lebanon's health ministry tracked a death toll crossing 3,269 killed since late February, with nearly 10,000 wounded, numbers that on a per capita basis for a country of 6 million represented a humanitarian catastrophe by any historical measure. And the Battle of Bint Jabil was grinding on between Israeli forces and Hezbollah's Radwan force in urban terrain that had been destroyed in 2006 and barely rebuilt since, and the fourth round of U.S.-brokered peace talks between Israeli and Lebanon was scheduled for June 2 and 3 in Washington, while Israeli ground forces were simultaneously maneuvering to secure new positions that any honest negotiator would recognize made the outcome of those talks harder rather than easier to achieve. Through the final days of May, the diplomatic track between the United States and Iran moved in two contradictory directions simultaneously, because on May 28th, U.S. officials confirmed that negotiators had finalized the text of a memorandum of understanding covering a 60-day nuclear negotiation period, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to unrestricted navigation, and discussion of unfreezing Iranian assets, with Iran's Tasnim news agency reporting that shipping volumes through the strait could return to pre-war levels within 30 days of signature, a timeline with enormous implications for global energy markets that had been pricing in the uncertainty of the closure for 3 months. But Trump had not signed off and had made additional demands, including language about regional normalization with Israel that Iran rejected because no Iranian government could present that as anything other than humiliation to its domestic audience in the middle of a war in which Israeli strikes had killed thousands of Lebanese civilians. And on May 25, the U.S. military conducted new strikes on Iranian positions within hours of Trump's public statement of dissatisfaction with the negotiations, and Iran's IRGC declared its right to respond to what it called ceasefire violations, and a ballistic missile from Iranian territory was intercepted over Kuwait, and Defense Secretary Hegseth warned on May 29 that the U.S. military was ready to resume full combat operations in the Gulf and was better positioned to do so than at the start of Operation Epic Fury, and the Persian Gulf Strait Authority defied its new Treasury sanctions designation by announcing continued operations without interruption, and Omani authorities reported a floating object believed to be a naval mine spotted in the strait, a reminder that 3 months of active naval warfare leave physical residue that does not dissolve because politicians are exchanging draft documents. And the girls' school hung over all of it, the one struck on February 28th that killed 168 children and 14 teachers when targeting systems used outdated data for a nearby naval facility, whose investigation U.S. Central Command said was approaching its conclusion, whose moral weight no investigation report could reduce, because the families of 182 people are still processing a grief that no memorandum drafted in hotel conference rooms in Muscat and Doha has any language to address. Threading through all three of these simultaneous crises is a common technological element that deserves analytical attention commensurate with its actual operational significance, which is the drone in its 2026 form, not the large, remotely piloted surveillance aircraft of the previous decade, but the small, cheap, commercially derived FPV-operated precision strike system that has been democratized across the military spectrum to the point where it is being used at industrial scale by the Ukrainian military, the Russian military, the Iranian IRGC, Hezbollah, and the U.S. Navy simultaneously in 3 different theaters. And the numbers in Ukraine alone illustrate what that industrialization means in practice. Russia launching more than 8,000 drones in April 2026 alone, the highest monthly total since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Ukraine striking 19,203 Russian personnel with its own systems in 19 days of May. Russia targeting Ukrainian cities with 122 UAVs in a single overnight attack on May 24, hitting fuel storage and railway infrastructure and electrical substations across Kharkiv, Kyiv, Zaporizhia, Odessa, and a dozen other cities simultaneously. And in the Persian Gulf, the U.S. Navy consuming interceptor missiles at a rate that placed strain on logistics planning because each successful intercept of an Iranian ballistic missile required the expenditure of systems costing orders of magnitude more than the projectiles they destroyed, a cost imbalance that does not determine military outcomes in the short term, but accumulates over months into a logistics constraint that operational planners cannot ignore. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah drones had forced school closures and civilian movement restrictions across entire communities along the northern Israeli border, a tactical reality that Israeli military planners had no pre-existing doctrine to manage effectively. And the collective lesson being absorbed across all 3 fronts simultaneously is that the era in which military superiority could be measured primarily by inventories of advanced fighter jets and aircraft carriers and main battle tanks has been fundamentally complicated by the emergence of cheap precision systems that can be manufactured at civilian industrial scale and deployed by entities ranging from major state militaries to irregular forces at a pace that outstrips the production rates of the high-cost systems designed to defeat them. The humanitarian dimension of these 3 simultaneous conflicts, which receives the least analytical attention relative to its actual severity, deserves to be part of any honest assessment of where things stand at the end of May 2026, because the civilian populations absorbing the consequences of these military contests are not abstractions in a strategic framework. They are the population of Ukraine, 37 million people who have been living under active war for 4 years, with energy blackouts that, according to Ukrainian economic assessments, have cut economic growth by 2.5 percentage points in each of the past 2 years, with the destruction of civilian infrastructure across every major city, with the constant psychological weight of missile alerts and the knowledge that Russian drones targeting their cities are launched at rates exceeding 8,000 per month. And they are the population of Lebanon, 6 million people caught between Hezbollah and the Israeli military in a geography that offers no neutral ground, watching their cities absorb strikes that have killed over 3,000 of them since February alone, evacuating communities in the south that have been evacuated and returned and evacuated again so many times over the past 2 decades that the act of leaving has become an institutional memory rather than an emergency response. And they are the population of Iran, 90 million people who watched their supreme leader killed in an airstrike, who absorbed the economic shock of the Hormuz closure and the American counterblockade simultaneously, whose internet was restricted in the aftermath of the February drone attacks.